Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, the podcast that celebrates trailblazing women in sport. I'm Sue Anstis, and I'd like to start with a big thank you to our partners Sport England, who support The Game Changers through a National Lottery Award. I'm delighted to say that this, the 13th season of the podcast, is a serialisation of my book, Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. Chapter 15. Oh, so you're a lesbian then? I hate the word homophobia. It's not a phobia. You're not scared. You're an arsehole. Attributed to Morgan Freeman, 2012. Having worked in women's sport for over 30 years, I've witnessed what a positive place it can be for the LGBTQ+ community. Sport provides an inclusive environment, enabling women and girls to feel fully accepted, whatever their sexuality. Being part of a team can be a safe haven for a young woman, normalising her identity in a way she may not have experienced elsewhere. Sadly, however, societal perception about queer women can also be the very thing that drives girls away from sport. Women who play sport have historically been stereotyped as lesbians and, at a time when young women feel the pressure to conform, inundated with messages of what a traditional feminine female should look like, the perceived prevalence of queerness within women's sport can be confusing and off-putting. Deviating from what society deems to be the norm can be scary for teenage girls and may lead them to reject sport entirely. The topic itself can be hard to discuss for fear of causing offence. I'm anxious even writing this chapter, as terminology is constantly shifting and words can mean different things to different audiences. The term queer, for instance, has evolved from a word used to describe something odd in the 1920s to something extremely derogatory when I was growing up, to a word that the LGBTQ+ community has now taken and made their own. When I use the word queer in this chapter, I do so as an inclusive term encompassing lesbian, bisexual and gender non-conforming women. I know that national governing bodies with a goal to drive increased participation have struggled with the depiction of their sports. Will celebrating the fact that your sport is so inclusive potentially alienate young women who may be questioning whether they can find a place in a sport associated with lesbians? Are high-profile gay athletes going to put girls off, or are parents less likely to encourage their daughters to play sport if they think they might be exposed to lesbians? As ridiculous as this sounds, it's a genuine concern for some, especially in the historically homophobic conservative states of the US. I've witnessed firsthand the positive impact sport had on my own daughter, both her sense of identity and her happiness. Even in a Western society that is more accepting than ever before in our history, coming out at 15 was tough for Molly. Rugby provided her with an open and accepting place where she could be herself, no longer needing to hide or question who she was. In her own words, it was freeing and refreshing to be part of a team where I didn't need to think twice about my sexuality. I was interested in understanding more about the history around lesbianism in sport. How did it start, and why has it been seen as something so negative in the past? As I researched the topic, it's clear that the US has a much richer written history around sexuality and women's sport than we have in the UK. What follows, therefore, is not a definitive record, but my own commentary on the elements that resonated with me as I look back through the lens of sport. Linking mannish female athletes to lesbianism goes back to the 1880s, when the medical community was exploring sexuality. Attraction to women was considered an entirely male trait. If a woman was attracted to another woman, it was seen as the total inversion of gender identity, a biological tragedy in which a male soul existed in a woman's body, according to sexologists at the time. They also noted that lesbians preferred masculine sports and labour, and that among lesbians there is often some capacity for athletics. It was primarily with shifts in culture and attitudes to sex in the 1920s and 30s that the association between lesbianism and sport took hold. Until that time, society had worried that sport would negatively affect female sexuality in two ways. First, it would impair a woman's fertility and her ability to have children, and second, it would make her into a muscle mole, a woman who lost her physical and moral control because of the powerful impulses of sport. As views on morality changed in the 1920s, it was recognised that women did have sexual desires. The previous Victorian ideal of a passionless wife evolved into the confident, sexually liberated flappers of the Jazz Age. It was from this point that sexuality became central to consumer culture and the vision of modern femininity was established. An advertisement at the time stated simply, "The first duty of a woman is to attract." Whilst it was recognised that women could now be sexually active and attractive, this was only if they were attracting men. It was at this time of sexual liberation for women, with a growing presence of lesbians in society, that the public began to show concern about mannish lesbians. During the hard years of the Depression, there was a hostile backlash against strong, independent women in society, including feminists, career women, and lesbians. Critics claimed that sport would make women more mannish and therefore unlikely to find heterosexual love in the future. In the US, PE colleges and the women's sports departments at universities became concerned that too much female companionship might have a negative impact on the sexual desires of their students. They organised co-ed events to redress the balance, along with activities to emphasise the grace and beauty of their students. The stigma of lesbianism became more explicit after the Second World War. Society became hostile towards anyone who did not conform to traditional gender norms, and women in physical education and working-class sports became an easy target for homophobic condemnation. LGBTQ+ communities began to grow in major US cities such as San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York in the 1940s, attracting thousands of gay and lesbian migrants who felt safe and accepted in these places as the growth in bars, nightclubs, and networks expanded. But sadly, the very presence of the queer community stirred up fear and hatred in society. It is shocking to learn more of how Western society treated homosexuals in the 1950s. LGBTQ+ people were seen by some as diseased or mentally unsound. Reformers thought they could somehow be cured, and gay men were often treated with castration, lobotomies, nerve surgery, and electroshock treatment in psychiatric institutions. As a homosexual panic spread, promoting mass fear and loathing of the LGBTQ+ community, the US government purged itself of gay men or lesbians from any government or military post and encouraged the police to crack down on gay bars and communities. Queer people lost their jobs, their homes, and their families. Many took their own lives. For young gay women growing up at this time, it must have been a terrifying experience to realise you were attracted to someone of the same sex. Women were unable to share their feelings with friends and family, and there was no reassuring depiction of gay people in books or any role models in the media. Queer women felt lonely and isolated as they hid their sexuality in everyday life. Sport, therefore, became an important sanctuary, one of the few places where women could be themselves and socialise with other lesbians. From the 1930s through to the 1960s, many LGBTQ+ women across the world found competitive sports such as hockey, basketball, football, athletics, bowling, and softball an ideal place to form friendships and create a shared culture. Sports gave women the opportunity to bond with other women as teammates, friends, and partners. They met others like them and felt accepted and included in a group. Sport provided one of the few social spaces where gay women could relax with freedom to live their lives without judgment. That said, their relationships were still discreet and secretive. Meanwhile, any female athletes noted for their masculine bodies and displaying male attributes of strength, power, and speed became targets for anti-homosexual attacks. Male writers mocked female sport, portraying all female athletes as mannish types who disdained men and desired women. This meant that any sports wanting to attract a paying audience at that time had to feminize themselves to counter any negativity associated with lesbianism. As previously mentioned, in the US, basketball and softball competitions added beauty pageants to their events, and women were banned from wearing clothes that might make them look mannish. Sportswomen could be sacked from the professional teams simply for having short, bobbed haircuts. Unfortunately, the leaders in women's sport, while trying to protect the reputation of women's sport from the negative perceptions of society, only made things worse for LGBTQ+ athletes. In an attempt to ensure their events and programs conformed with the new feminine heterosexual ideal of a time, they just reinforced the public's views that celebrated heterosexuality and condemned lesbianism. The Netflix documentary Secret Love is a moving depiction of the challenge some female athletes faced in hiding their true selves for generations. It tells the story of Terry Donahue and Pat Henschel, two former professional baseball players who kept their relationship a secret for 70 years. It appears that the same opportunities for female intimacy that drew the queer community to sport during these decades may also have pushed other women away. In the US, by the mid-1950s, the majority of American women showed little interest in competitive sport, mainly because of its off-putting reputation for being too masculine and a place for lesbians. This attitude of non-sporty girls who don't want to look mannish or be accused of being gay is still apparent today, but fortunately, times are changing. Things feel much more positive today as wider societal attitudes to the LGBTQ+ community evolve, and the presence of gay women in sport is more accepted than ever before. With increased tolerance and acceptance of diversity, we have seen same-sex marriage legalised in 29 countries and the emergence of high-profile queer women, including global celebrities such as Lady Gaga, Jodie Foster, Kristen Stewart, Angelina Jolie, Miley Cyrus, and Cara Delevingne, along with our own homegrown entertainers such as Claire Balding, Sue Perkins, Sandy Toksvig, and Rita Ora. In 2020, former GB boxer and Olympic champion Nicola Adams took part in BBC's Strictly Come Dancing with a female professional, the first time the show had had same-sex partners competing. It was such a shame that they had to leave the show early after Katja Jones, Nicola's dance partner, tested positive for COVID-19. Here's hoping Nicola may be back on the show in 2021. It is also wonderful to reflect that at the 2019 FIFA Women's World Cup, there were 40 out LGBTQ+ participants, 38 players along with one coach and a trainer. Clearly, the numbers may well have been higher than this, with teams competing from countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon, and Jamaica, where homosexuality is still punishable with a prison sentence, and other countries whose levels of societal homophobia may keep many players closeted. Possibly the most famous lesbian in women's sport today is Megan Rapinoe, vice-captain of the US women's soccer team, who became a global icon for tolerance in 2019, campaigning on a raft of important issues. Her fiancé, Sue Bird, is a leading WNBA player who is having a similar impact. With Rapinoe attracting huge commercial sponsorships from brands including Nike, Samsung and Budweiser, and Sue and Megan featuring together in advertisements for Symetra life insurance, it's a relief to be living in a time when her sexuality hasn't damaged her commercial standing in the way it did for Martina Navratilova in the 1970s. After Martina was forced to acknowledge being a lesbian, her image suffered, and she reportedly lost millions of dollars of endorsement as a result. In August 2016, two of our very own gay sporting icons, Kate and Helen Richardson-Walsh, became the first ever same-sex couple to play together on the same team at an Olympics when the GB women's hockey team won gold in Rio. It was a momentous moment for the LGBTQ+ community, but I was interested to know whether they were worried that the news of their relationship might overshadow the team's incredible achievements on the pitch. I don't think it concerned us at the time because we were very aware of the magnitude of it. There are still, today, people living in the world who will be killed or jailed because of their sexuality. So actually, two people just talking about it in an open way was important, explains Kate. However, I think that some of our teammates were understandably concerned, and I know Danny, the GB coach, said the first thing he got asked walking into the media zone after we just won that gold medal was, "Isn't it great Kate and Helen have won gold as the first same-sex couple?" He was angry. And it's really hard because he's not angry that we are a couple, but there was so much more to it than that. There have been moments like that when it's really uncomfortable, says Kate, who hopes the media might do better and look at the wider story in the future. I've always thought that team sport is a place where women can very comfortably be themselves, whether that be straight, lesbian, bisexual, especially in comparison to men's sports. But Kate doesn't feel the landscape is quite as positive as I've painted it. There are still lots of women living a double life, and that's completely up to them, of course. No one has to be open with their private lives. It's their private life. It's incredibly sad, I reflect, that they can't be themselves in the sport they love. It is, replies Kate. If you feel you can't be yourself, then things need to be looked at. So, I think women's sport is better, particularly at grassroots level. I think it's much better than for men. But I think that at elite level, it's still quite closeted, actually. I asked Kate why she thinks that is. Are these women worried that it might impact their sponsorship deals, their profile, or media opportunities? Yes. And maybe they don't want the whole focus to be about the fact that they're bisexual or lesbian and actually just want to talk about sport. And I think that's probably quite a big fear and a real fear. And then for men, there is that, plus the stereotypical traditions of what it means to be a man, and what it means to be a man that plays sport. Kate thinks that the next generation coming through will demand that those traditions and stereotypes are broken. Unfortunately, it just takes time. I think people are beginning to be more well-educated, but that's why education in schools is so important. In order to accept difference, you have to learn about it and understand it, and I think that has to start at the youngest age. It's perhaps not surprising that some gay women in sport are reticent to go public about their sexuality when researchers still talk of the dominance of heterosexism in sport and the homophobia that exists amongst coaches, players, parents, and administrators. Studies also show that lesbian athletes have historically been devalued in the commercial marketplace and are less likely to receive sponsorships or endorsements than heterosexual teammates. There is clearly a higher proportion of LGBTQ plus women playing sport than in the general population. Much of this has evolved historically, as we have seen, because women's sports have been, and still are, such an inclusive and supportive environment for queer women. The bigger issue, of course, is why an individual's sexuality should be an issue at all. David Stern, the NBA commissioner who championed the creation of the WNBA, knew that in the US, homophobia, along with racism and sexism, was part of the reason the WNBA met with such resistance. He saw the power of sport and the growth of the WNBA to break down some of those barriers. Stern told a story about a conversation he once had with an NBA WNBA team owner, whom he described as very conservative. The owner had been approached by a fan who told him she was a lesbian and a lifelong women's sports fan. She thanked him for providing a place for women to play where she also felt welcome. Now, I happen to know his views were probably not very consistent with that fan's views on a lot of things, Stern said. So I asked him, "What did you say?" And he said, "I said thank you too." So I knew there were some broader societal issues that were at work there that the WNBA could impact in a positive way. Being open about your sexuality can be a challenge, especially when you are a high-profile athlete. When Casey Stoney, then captain of the England women's football team, came out in 2015, she said she was a gay woman in football, but that did not mean to say that every woman playing football is gay. I asked her why she felt it was so important to make that point. I hate stereotypes. And that's one of the reasons I didn't come out for so long. Because of the whole, "Oh, of course she's gay, she plays football." Half of my friends in football are married to men. I hate pigeonholing, I hate stereotypes. That was why it was so important to me to say, "Right, yeah, I am gay, but it is not because I play football, and I didn't want that stereotype for the rest of my friends in football." Was she scared about coming out when she did? It felt it was the right time in terms of being England captain, using my platform for a positive. Was I petrified? Absolutely. Did I know what was going to happen? No. Probably about 98% was so positive, with many people reaching out to me and to say thank you. You can understand the impact that Casey's decision had when she shares a memory from that time. I remember one specific parent messaged me to say, "Thanks so much. My daughter came down last night and had a conversation with me, and that was really, really nice." There are moments when you go, that is why I did it, because it made that young girl have the courage to go and speak to her mum and not live in fear. As a parent, I don't want to know half of my little girl. I want to know all of her. Being able to influence someone like that was quite a thing for me. I asked Casey if she is worried that the homophobia that still surrounds women's sport could put teenage girls off at a time when they are very sensitive to what people think about them. Yes, I do. I think that if you are 13 or 14, there is a stereotype. You think, "I do not want to be called a lesbian," so you don't do the sport, and that is unfair. There are a lot of gay women in sport. There are, statistically, because it is more accepting. But it doesn't mean there aren't a lot of heterosexual women. There are, an awful lot. But you're right. I think the stereotype of being butch can put people off. I think the stereotypes of being gay put people off. It's more so in football and rugby. There are a lot of gay women in tennis that don't have the same stereotype of being butch, because they wear a white dress and they go out on court and play tennis. But they are still strong, athletic women. I hate the stereotypes. Just let people do their jobs. It is about changing societal attitudes about what is feminine and strong. Yes, you can be strong and athletic, And you can still look beautiful in a dress. I was reticent about including the subject of trans women in sport in this book, not because I don't think it's something that warrants discussion, but because of the levels of anger the topic can generate on both sides of the debate. In 2019, when I asked Anna Kessel if there were any topics she was wary of covering in the paper, she said, "I suppose the one biggest issue that I don't know the answer to is trans. And how do we approach that? How do we solve it? I don't know. I think even when people have been well-meaning, someone like Martina Navratilova, who I respect hugely, but when she came out and wrote that opinion piece, I hate to say anything negative about her because I just think she's incredible, but the language that she used was so disrespectful. I think no matter where you sit on the spectrum, you have to come with respect when you talk about it. And if you don't, A, no one's going to listen, you're going to get everyone's backs up. But B, I just can't take your point of view seriously unless you are able to discuss it in a dispassionate way, in a calmer, dispassionate way. Like Anna, I do not have the answers to the issues raised by trans women competing in elite sport. I feel very strongly about the overriding importance of inclusivity. Trans women are women, and therefore they should be included in the realm of women's sport. It is about dignity and respect, and not denying those who identify as women any of the incredible benefits that we know sport offers. I do appreciate that trans women's inherent strength and power could become an issue in competitive sport. Most trans women who have gone through male puberty will have larger lungs, hearts, limbs, etc., a physiological legacy that cannot be nullified with hormone treatments or surgery. Reducing testosterone levels now will not eradicate those advantages. And then, of course, there is the ethical issue of forcing anyone to have hormone treatment just to do what they love. Whatever the various sporting bodies like the IOC decide in terms of the treatments required to compete, those assigned male at birth who have gone through puberty will generally remain bigger and more powerful than those assigned female at birth. And in the majority of competitive sport, speed and strength and power are advantages. Should this matter though, transgender female athletes will have physiological advantages, but I have heard people argue the case that this is one of the key features of competitive sport. Elite male and female athletes may have abnormal physical traits, the very thing that contributes to making them extraordinary in their sports. The height of NBA basketballers, for instance, in 2018, an incredible 48 of them were over 7 feet tall. Or the lung capacity of Michael Phelps, reportedly twice that of the average human at 12 litres. Those using this argument are keen to point out that we don't see other male athletes complaining about these physical advantages. On the other side, scaremongers would have us believe that we are about to see a massive onslaught of athletes assigned male at birth who have transitioned, winning US university scholarships or Olympic medals, and enjoying the subsequent commercial sponsorships this might bring. They believe female athletes will miss out having fought so hard for equality in sport, and that's not fair or just. I am not sure this is the case. What I would hate to see is an outright blanket ban of all trans women in sport at every level. That feels too draconian. The FA currently considers each person on a case-by-case basis, which might be a potential approach. In 2020, World Rugby became the first international federation to consider the issue of trans women in the game, and I asked Katie Sadlier to tell me about that process when they were in the consultation mode. World Rugby doesn't just make calls without consulting its members, and this is incredibly tricky and difficult, a challenge for any sport to address. Katie outlined the comprehensive review group, chaired by a psychiatrist that includes doctors, coaches, legal experts and players who considered if the current policy is fit for purpose. There were question marks about the policy that the IOC had, particularly in terms of how it applied to rugby, and it would have been professionally inept of us to just pretend that didn't exist. The research cited by World Rugby showed that a reduction of testosterone does not lead to a proportionate reduction in mass, muscle mass, strength or power, and presents a clear safety risk. It calculated that players who are assigned male at birth are stronger by 25 to 50%, are 30% more powerful, 40% heavier, and about 15% faster than women playing in the same competitive matches, and estimates at least a 20 to 30% greater risk of a female player being injured if tackled by a player who's gone through male puberty. The real challenge when you looked at all the research that was put in front of that group was that we are a sport that prides itself on inclusivity and diversity, and inclusion is really, really important. But we also put player welfare as our number one priority, and there were challenges that were coming from the wider community about whether or not this was fair, says Katie. World Rugby is committed to making sure that it remains itself an inclusive sport. It may very well be that we need to just think about how that happens in a different way, but there have been no decisions made at this stage. I know that there have been some absolutely passionate women players that have come back and said they think it is atrocious that we are looking at this. I think it would be professionally irresponsible for us not to look at it. Following this comprehensive review, at the end of 2020, World Rugby updated its transgender participation guidelines. The new guidelines do not recommend that trans women play women's contact rugby on safety grounds at the international level of the game where size, strength, power and speed are crucial for both risk and performance. An important caveat, though, was that World Rugby do not preclude national unions from flexibility in their application of the guidelines at the domestic or community level of the game. Chair of the review panel, Dr. Arabachinto, went on to explain, unions will be able to exercise flexibility on a case-by-case basis at the community level of the game, for which the unions are responsible, while World Rugby will continue to prioritise inclusion strategies to ensure that the trans community remain an active, welcome and important member of the rugby family. To conclude the announcement, World Rugby Chairman Zabil Beaumont added, "Rugby is a welcoming and inclusive sport, and while this has been a difficult decision to make, it has been taken following comprehensive consultation and engagement, and for the right reasons, given the risk of injury. That said, we recognise the science continues to evolve, and we are committed to regularly reviewing these guidelines, always seeking to be inclusive." I welcome World Rugby's openness to addressing the challenge, because the biggest issue for me right now is that we're not able to talk about the topic calmly. Any debate on the subject is immediately shut down by both sides, whatever your opinion, even if you're just open to finding out more. The Twitter sphere is this hotbed of vitriol, anger and hatred. You're either a transphobe or TERF, trans-exclusionary radical feminist, or you're going to be cancelled by others for supporting or not supporting the trans community. I desperately hope that in the future we might all be kinder and more open-minded in order to explore what is a complex and emotive issue for everyone. In closing this chapter, I circle back to where I started. Let's celebrate women's sport. It's a remarkable place where women can truly and authentically be themselves, regardless of their sexual orientation. Who wouldn't want that for their daughters? Who wouldn't want that for all women and girls? Thank you so much for listening to the serialisation of my book Game On, The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. If you'd like a copy, it's available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops and online. The Game Changers podcast is free to listen to on all podcast platforms. Head over to fearlesswomen.co.uk to find out more about all of the incredible game changers I've spoken to in previous series. There are over 100 of them, including elite athletes, journalists, coaches, scientists, broadcasters and CEOs. As well as listening to all the episodes on the website, you can find out more about the Women's Sport Collective, a free, inclusive network for all women working in sport. And you can register for the Fearless Women newsletter, a weekly review of the global developments in women's sport. Do come and say hello on social media, where you'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter at Sue Anstis. Finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I'd be so grateful if you could do two things. Firstly, if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd really appreciate it. And secondly, if there's anyone in your life, at home or at work, who you think might enjoy the podcast, please do let them know about it and help us spread the word about women's sport and the stories of these incredible game changers.